Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch with me, your host, Vikas Swarup. This is a show which tries to demystify diplomacy. That is why in previous editions of this show, we have tried to acquaint our viewers with the various modes and types of diplomacy. We have examined economic diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, and diaspora diplomacy. Tonight, we will focus on a new type of diplomacy which has gained prominence in recent years. It is driven by technology and is very different from traditional diplomacy. Classical diplomacy was a formal process conducted secretly behind closed doors within small networks of professional diplomats. This new type of diplomacy is informal, is conducted in the open, and not just by diplomats. I am talking about eDiplomacy or digital diplomacy, which is the act of attempting to achieve diplomatic goals through the use of the internet and communications technology in general. E-diplomacy has been able to flourish because of the rise of social media and the increased awareness of its power. Whereas it was once easier for governments to control their message through print or broadcast media, social media can be even more powerful given its immediacy, accessibility, and pervasiveness. The problem, however, is that messages distributed via social media lack filters, are difficult to control, and can lead to unpredictable responses. Today, we see heads of state framing or changing foreign policy in an instant through the medium of a 280-character tweet. Prime ministers exchanging greetings, ideas, and sometimes jabs on Twitter. Foreign ministries using social media to assist citizens during a crisis. Corporate leaders and civil society engaging with international affairs through WhatsApp and Facebook. And even lethal, non-state actors like terrorist groups trying to recruit people online. There is no doubt that the use of social media has led to a paradigm shift in the craft of diplomacy. The governments and leaders of 189 countries have an official presence on the social network, representing 98% of the 193 UN member states. The governments of only 4 countries do not have a Twitter presence, namely Laos, North Korea, Sao Tome and Principe, and Turkmenistan. India was an early adapter of social media. Former External Affairs Minister, the late Srimati Sushma Swaraj, was a superhero on Twitter, carving out a unique niche for herself as an accessible and caring minister who continuously strived to assist Indian citizens in distress anywhere in the world who sent her a tweet. A tradition that has been continued by her successor, Dr. Jaishankar, who also bonds with his counterparts on Twitter on their national occasions. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is today the most followed serving head of government, with a staggering 78.6 million followers on Twitter and 46 million on Facebook. And he has used this power very effectively, from popularizing the global conduct of the International Day of Yoga as a form of cultural diplomacy, to deepening bilateral ties with friendly countries by tweeting in their own language. PM Modi's Diplomacy is a tool that has given unparalleled traction to India's diplomatic outreach. So how is Indian diplomacy adapting to the digital age? What is the power and what are the perils and pitfalls of e-diplomacy? To discuss these issues, I have with me 2 outstanding experts. With me in the studio is Ambassador Navdeep Suri. In his 36-year career in the Indian Foreign Service, he served as India's ambassador to Egypt, Australia, and the UAE. He is also the translator of 4 classic Punjabi works of his grandfather, Nanak Singh, into English. More importantly, he headed the Public Diplomacy Division in the Ministry of External Affairs when social media was just emerging. And joining us from Geneva is Dr. Jovan Kurbalija, the Executive Director of DiploFoundation and head of the Geneva Internet Platform. An expert on e-diplomacy and internet governance, Dr. Kurbalija is a former diplomat with professional and academic background in international law, diplomacy, and information technology. Let me start with you, Dr. Kurbalija. The craft of diplomacy has evolved continuously. It has adapted to technological advancements from the advent of the Morse telegraph to the emergence of radio broadcasting and now to the rise of social media. How has digital become a game changer for diplomacy, and is e-diplomacy the future of diplomacy?
Thank you, Ambassador Swarup. It's a great pleasure to be in the Diplomatic Dispatch, and you posed the critical question about our era. Answer to this question could be found by reflecting on the past. If we want to see our current moment and future, it's always useful to reflect on the past. And if we reflect on history of diplomacy and technology, we can see that with every new technology, communication technology, telegraph, telephone, radio, even smoke signals, if we want that way, you can see the impact of diplomacy in three main areas. Changes in geopolitics, and we are seeing today changes in geopolitics worldwide around data, AI, cables, interdependence. And I know that India is reconsidering different digital geopolitical aspects. Therefore, diplomats should be aware of that, changing environment. Second, there is a change with the new topics on diplomatic agenda. Diplomats have to negotiate privacy, data protection, cybersecurity, and other related issues, in addition to traditional diplomatic issues. And third area of impact throughout the history and today is emergence of new tools, which I guess we'll focus today. Social media, artificial intelligence, and other tools that diplomats can use in their day-to-day activity. While we are reflecting on these three aspects, geopolitics, new topics, and new tools, it's always useful to keep in mind what is the purpose of diplomacy and get back to the Article 3 of Vienna Convention. The purpose of diplomacy is to negotiate, to represent the interests of a country abroad, and to contribute to the public good. While we are navigating these tectonic shifts in diplomacy, it's always useful to be anchored in these main purposes of diplomatic activities: negotiating, representing, and contributing to the global public good. Therefore, this is a framing of today's discussion worldwide, sometimes driven by hype, but that hype could be questioned and anchored by getting back to the history and to the purpose of diplomacy.
Speaking of the future, Dr. Kurbalija, how do you see the future of social media in the context of the recent purchase of Twitter by billionaire Elon Musk and his own ideas of reforming Twitter, as well as the impact of the new EU data regulations? Will social media remain private or become a more public space? And in this context, how should diplomatic services react?
Exactly. You point to one of the key debates of today. We have been hearing about Elon Musk and Twitter, but there is also major development in European Union with Digital Service Act, which was just accepted. But it boils down to the question, how we ensure that we have a freedom of communication, of information, while ensuring also protection of the public interest and reducing misinformation, misuse of social media. This is a formula which has been negotiating in the governments, parliaments, and the governing board of big companies. Diplomacy has to participate in it, in global negotiations, here in Geneva, in Human Rights Council, in New York, in regional organizations. But when it comes to the use of social media, it should probably raise the question if there is any protection that diplomatic communication on Twitter, on Facebook, should enjoy. Maybe not complete diplomatic immunity, but some sort of protection of the right of the governments to communicate via this indispensable social media channels.
Ambassador Suri, as head of the Public Diplomacy Division, you opened the first Twitter account of MEA way back in July 2010, which turned out to be the first tentative step into the social media domain by any Indian government department at that time. Why was the MEA the first to adapt to social media?
I think diplomats with their overseas exposure perhaps tend to be a little bit more open to new ideas. But for me, when I was heading that division, perhaps the eureka moment was one phrase at a conference: the need to move away from diplomats' traditional need to know mindset to a need to share mindset. And when I wrote my first paper on this, I think there was a bit of shock and awe in the ministry that was I intending to give out any state secrets through the social media. And I had to come back with counter arguments that how is a security obsessed country like Israel using social media in those early days in 2010. And anyway, we secured the approvals. But I think for the first few months, there was still a fair amount of skepticism in the ministry and wariness in other parts of government about what was this new experiment that we were embarking upon. I think the moment of truth really came after Colonel Gaddafi's assassination and the turmoil that you saw in Libya. And we had about 18,000 stranded Indian nationals. And if I can tell you just a small story on this. So we started putting out information on which Air India flight would land when at Tripoli or Benghazi to bring back our stranded nationals. And one gentleman from Chennai starts sending very angry messages that this is all a PR exercise by the government of India, and the real people who need help are ignored. And I asked, tell us more. And it transpired in this conversation with somebody that we did not know that his father was amongst 200 Indians stranded in the Libya Iron and Steel Company plant in Sirte. Okay. So we approached our ambassador, said, how do we get these 200 people out? And she said, it's very unsafe because there is serious fighting taking place around Sirte. Got this information back to the gentleman in Chennai, who we still hadn't met. And he calls his father and says, yes, you are right. But you know, the steel plant has its own jetty. And maybe if you can get a ferry to come across. So corroborating that information, we hired a ferry out of Malta and plucked out 200 Indians out of Sirte. And it was a revelation that, oh my God, you know, this capacity that you now have to go beyond your visual range, beyond your email list of contacts to people out there who are interested, who are involved and engaged. And I think the two things that came out, one was this thing that if you engage, you build credibility. And now we were being trusted and believed. And the second was you do not need to rely on just your traditional press releases and other. So the power of social media, the way it was unleashed for us in that particular instance in 2010 was quite something. After that, there was no looking back. And after that, we had other ministries adapting it as well.
So this leads me to my second question. How has the Ministry of External Affairs evolved in its use of social media since those early days?
I think we've come a really long way. Today, use of social media, use of eDiplomacy tools is almost an integral part of how we act as diplomats, how we practice our craft. If you look at the External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, or the official spokesperson, everything that they say is out on Twitter, it's out on Facebook. You do a press conference, before you know it, it's out on SoundCloud, it's out on YouTube. What it does is it gives journalists and others interested access to real-time, accurate, authentic information. And that serves a very valuable purpose. But we've also seen the way it has grown beyond that and beyond sort of the PR tools of greetings and so on, into a portal that promotes the International Day of Yoga across the globe, and the magnifier that it becomes for India's soft power. You see it in something as simple as the Madad portal, which has become like a lifeline for Indians in distress, sometimes Indian students in distress. And you know, it shows you real time how many grievances have been received. And this was a game changer because we were often seen as opaque and unresponsive, but now suddenly you're out in the open. Look at the way the eMigrate portal, again from the Ministry of External Affairs, helps out blue-collar workers, makes sure that they have proper contracts, makes sure that they don't get duped by employers or by unscrupulous recruitment agents. And look at how we use iTech again as a portal. We've had an Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation Program going on since 1964. But it was kind of a fire and forget policy. You know, people have come, they've attended programs, and then that's the end of it. Today, we can keep connected with them through the portal that we've created. We have even run online courses for them.
During the pandemic, I believe that's what we did.
During the pandemic.
Yes.
So I think the ministry has shown this capacity to evolve over the last decade and embrace the latest tools that are available. And I think what it has done is really enhance the effectiveness of our diplomacy.
Following on from this, Dr. Kurbalija, how has the COVID-19 pandemic promoted digitalization in diplomacy?
Well, it accelerated the changes, as Ambassador indicated. What was a possibility to have online meetings for 10 years suddenly became reality. And if we can say digital technology ensured the business continuity of diplomacy through use of social media, dealing with the crisis, meeting multilaterally and bilaterally. The pendulum shifted from more or less exclusive face-to-face meetings in multilateral and bilateral space to online meetings. Diplomats adjusted very fast. Sometimes it is said that diplomacy is a conservative profession, but we follow it carefully. And it was amazing how agile, flexible, and adjustable were the diplomatic services to adjust to this change. Now, after that shift and possibility that discovered in reality that we can meet, even sometimes negotiate online, the pendulum is shifting back. We are having more and more meetings in situ. It's very human and natural that people would like to greet each other in person. And what we are noticing in Geneva as one of the capitals of multilateral diplomacy is that the pendulum is basically moving in the center of something which could be called a hybrid diplomacy, from online meetings during the Zoom era, back to the face-to-face, and now hybrid meetings, finding exactly when you need to meet in person, probably to manage crises, to discuss very delicate political issues, but then to cover technical issues and ongoing negotiation, you can use Zoom a lot. Therefore, we will probably study this in the history of diplomacy as one of the major points in the use of these new tools.
Ambassador Suri, I think the MEA was again the first to recognize that the pandemic was not going to be a short-lived affair and moved swiftly to the online realm. Can you give us some examples of creative uses of social media during the pandemic by MEA?
Well, look, the first bilateral summit between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Scott Morrison of Australia,
yes,
which had been postponed twice for a variety of reasons, because there was enough momentum behind our bilateral relationship, the two leaders decided to go ahead. And as early as June 2020, which is during the first wave of the pandemic, you saw that summit take place, and it accomplished many of its desired objectives. More recently, we have concluded two very complex trade negotiations with UAE and with Australia, culminating in actual trade agreements, with the negotiations largely conducted through virtual means. And this has meant, actually, in some cases, an enhanced effectiveness, because when you talk to your trade negotiators, they always tell you, with so many different parts of the government involved, from finance, from trade, from science, from IPR or other people, it was always difficult to get the diaries matched and to get them to travel at the same time as a block. Today, with the tools that you have, you are able to get them to meet virtually and have these meetings very professionally conducted and actually deliver results. You see joint commission meetings happening as well on a regular basis. During COVID, we saw wonderful visuals of planes going out with vaccines being provided by India. And it was nice to get a feel for that was happening around the world. But I'd agree with what Dr. Jovan said, that we are moving conclusively into a hybrid era. We've discovered the usefulness of the online tools, but there is no substitute for a personal interaction. In the first flush of the pandemic and so on, people started talking about virtual diplomacies and so on. But I think to the extent that handshake and an eye contact and the hand on the shoulder and maybe in some cultures a beer in the evening contributes to the success of diplomatic engagement, all of these tools will work hand in hand with the ones that Dr. Jovan spoke about.
Dr. Kurbalija, we all remember the Arab Spring, the revolutionary wave of demonstrations and protests in the Middle East and North Africa between 2010 and 2012, which were mobilized mainly through social media and led to regime change in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Yemen. Now, some experts are describing the ongoing war in Ukraine as the first social media war, given the number of people on the ground in Ukraine sharing real-time reports from the front lines, political leaders sharing news updates on Twitter, and celebrities and influencers raising awareness and donations on Instagram. What are its implications for diplomacy? Does it make it harder or easier to end the war?
It is definitely changing the space in diplomacy can operate and achieve peace or compromise on the resolution of the conflicts. As you indicated, social media is impacting the way how a war is conducted. It's shaping public opinion. It has enormous influence. And it is competing with traditional media in that sense. When it comes to diplomacy, what we can learn that sometimes some level of discretion is needed, because social media tends to force negotiators to speak to the audience or gallery back home. Always the next elections are around the corner, or diplomats should take care of their careers. And that is a problem if we don't communicate to our interlocutor on the other side of the table instead of communicating to the public back home. And if we analyze carefully the recent breakthroughs in diplomatic negotiation, starting from Iran nuclear negotiation in 2015 to Afghanistan negotiation, you can always see that there was a limited presence of social media in negotiating room. Negotiating sides were using social media to test or signal. It is another use of social media, to test new concepts, to see how public will react. But there was no broadcasting or tweeting from the negotiating room. This is more or less what is the conclusion. Fast-changing public space in which diplomacy has to operate with the news from the Ukraine war, for example, but also need to have limited use of social media when it comes to especially difficult negotiation around conflict resolution, humanitarian issues, and other questions related to security.
Ambassador Suri, you actually saw the protests in Tahrir Square in Cairo and the power of social media during your posting in Egypt. Tell us, how did you utilize social media to connect with the local Egyptians?
Well, one of the things that came out very clearly was that the first flush of the Arab Spring was as much an internet-driven revolution as it was a people's revolution. In fact, one of the first instigators in getting the people together was a Google executive called Wael Ghanem. And so, as ambassador, you saw the power of the youth and the need to connect with that young constituency that perhaps we had hitherto not been in contact with. So from our embassy, we started very active Facebook and Twitter accounts. But I think the game changer for us was the recognition that we had to do everything in Arabic language. And once we started putting out content in Arabic and visuals in Arabic, it really changed the dynamics in terms of our outreach. With the result that fairly early into my tenure, we were able to do a very interesting contest, design a poster which says, "Did you see the spirit of Gandhi in Tahrir?" And that is because I had seen a couple of posters of Gandhiji amongst people in the crowd. And the response that we got was phenomenal. We got some amazingly creative posters connecting Gandhiji's message of non-violent resistance with the mood and spirit of Tahrir Square. But it also helped us connect with the youth and perhaps also project Gandhiji's ideals in that country in a way that perhaps wouldn't have been possible otherwise. But with that network that we were able to create with the broad swathe of community in that country, when a year later we did our India by the Nile cultural festival, the kind of audiences that we were drawing were the envy of other diplomatic missions, because such a cross-section was coming from the elite to youth to people who just had an interest in India. And again, the fact that you could reach out into these untapped constituencies
using social media.
Using the power of social media.
Absolutely. Dr. Kurbalija, now China is an interesting case. On the one hand, it has banned Twitter in the country. But on the other hand, it engages actively on Twitter to promote its point of view and has unleashed its so-called wolf warriors who call out and aggressively hit back against perceived criticism against China. Do you think this approach is working?
Well, it reflects a general Chinese approach to the digital, where they keep the local space, national space, with Weibo, WeChat as sort of relatively disconnected from the rest of the world, and using existing social media channels and internet channels for their international activities and campaigns. We have been following recently one example on the history of ping-pong diplomacy, which was used, the ping-pong occasion of the anniversary of ping-pong diplomacy, 50 years, was used by China to send a signal towards the US public about the need to engage. And it was well received. As Ambassador said, elements of culture, sport, food sometimes could be a nice bridge builders when it comes to the social media campaign. Therefore, it worked well, back to your question, but it is difficult to say if Chinese social media diplomacy or public diplomacy has decisive influence on other global debates.
Ambassador Suri, this brings me to the problem of fake news, online trolls, and cybersecurity. How do diplomats deal with these phenomena? And what would be the common sense approach for ambassadors to follow?
I think the common sense approach is to treat your first entrance into social media as you would into some new club, where you must understand the rules and norms and behavior patterns of that club. Take that trouble to educate yourself on that. Diplomats can make very effective use of social media by giving a texture to their lives as diplomats, to the work that diplomats do, to enable the layperson to understand what diplomacy is about. But never make the mistake of thinking that just because I've put a disclaimer somewhere that opinions are personal, you can get away with posting stuff that is personal. There is no personal on social media when you are a practicing, working, serving diplomat. The official and the personal will continue to converge. And there have been horror stories of some innocent young British diplomat posting pictures of herself at a beach resort in Seychelles and then getting a lot of flack for saying, is this what you do as a diplomat? So please talk about your work. Talk about it in interesting ways. Add a nuance to the work of diplomacy. Try and keep your personal affairs out of it. When in doubt, don't post. Yes. If you really think that should I or shouldn't I guess it's better to be conservative than to do, and use it for the power that it gives you. There are other channels and outlets available to you if you want to talk about your personal stuff. As a diplomat, what I used to do is use my Twitter feed strictly for my office work, and sometimes use my Facebook page for stuff that was more personal, but still very careful. Is there anything that I post that could be an embarrassment for me or for my government? Stay away from it.
But people do post, as you said, and I remember this Twitter exchange, which happened a few years ago. A gentleman called Venkat tweeted to Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj saying that, Madam, my refrigerator is not working. Can you please get it repaired? And she gave a classic reply. She says, Dear brother, I'm sorry I cannot help you with your fridge because I'm busy helping humans in distress.
And yes, but because of the empathy that Mrs. Swaraj brought to her Twitter handle, she became a magnet for anyone in distress. And I think one of the endearing legacies of Mrs. Swaraj has been that culture of empathy for the helping out Indians in distress has become part of the ministry's culture across diplomatic missions around the world. And I think we do a fairly good job for that.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Suri and Dr. Kurbalija, for enlightening our viewers on the promise and perils of e-diplomacy. Social media is indeed allowing diplomats to see the big picture more clearly, leading to better analysis and better understanding of situations. It also allows governments to have a more interactive conversation with multiple stakeholders, as opposed to the one-way communication system which limits legacy media. But while digital tools have made diplomacy more open, transparent, and inclusive, they come with their own set of risks, and the diplomats must beware, because on the internet, there is no diplomatic immunity. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Diplomatic Dispatch. Till we meet again next week, good night and goodbye.